I'm so happy to be in this virtual space with each one of you. And so thankful that you chose to join us and to join Dr. Henderson Espinoza today, who is talking about imagining a future together. I mean, as a topic that is needed, especially now that we are experiencing and witnessing so much division in the country. And so I'm so glad that Dr. Henderson Espinoza accepted our invitation and that is here with us. And before we start with this webinar, I would like you all to join me in a moment of silence, and of prayer in solidarity with our Asian brothers and sisters and with the families of so many of them who are now grieving um, and suffering for the loss of loved ones and who have been victims also of violence. Um, this is a very painful time for many of us, and it should be painful for all of us because we are, as God called us to be, one body. And so we should all feel their pain. We should all feel their grief. And so I want to invite you to join me in a moment of silence. Dear Lord, uh, God creator, God of love, God of mercy, God of grace, God of unity, God of all. We pray today, O Lord, for our brothers and sisters, especially for our brothers and sisters. We pray for a renewal of hearts, transformation of minds. We trust, oh my Lord, that you are here, our God, our creator, that you continue creating anew. You are not done with us, God, and wow, we are so thankful that you continue creating things anew in our lives, because that gives us hope. That gives us the hope that we can change, that we can experience redemption and transformation, and that all those who have hate in their hearts can also experience redemption and transformation, O Lord. We ask for your presence in the lives of all our brothers and sisters, Asian brothers and sisters, for your peace, for your comfort to be with them today and always. In Jesus Christ we pray, amen.
It is an honor for me to introduce you all to Dr. Robyn Henderson Espinoza, PhD. Dr. Robyn Henderson Espinoza has been described in a myriad of ways: a scholar activist, a scholar leader, a thought leader, a teacher, public theologian, ethicist, poet of moral reason, and word artist. Among these ways of describing Dr. Robyn, they're also a visionary thinker who has spent 2 decades working in the borderlands of the church, the academy, and movements seeking to not only disrupt but dismantle supremacy culture by focusing their PhD studies on new concepts of being and becoming, on decolonizing knowledge and production, and on bridging with radical difference. They enflesh a deep hope of collaborating in these borderland spaces where their work seeks to contribute to the ongoing work of collective liberation. Dr. Robyn is the founder of Activist Theology Project. It's a Nashville-based collaborative project that seeks to work with the dominant culture and produces curriculum at the intersections of scholarship and activism. Dr. Robyn was named one of 10 faith leaders to watch by the Center of American Progress in 2018. We are very excited to have Dr. Robyn, so I will go ahead and open the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for such a generous and warm welcome. Greetings from the ancestral lands of the Cherokee, Yuchi, and Shawnee people who have stewarded the land that is called Nashville and Davidson County for many years. I'm really grateful to just be invited into this conversation. I like to think of the process of sharing ideas as a conversation. What we know is that this work of liberation, this work of healing on a collective scale requires a diversity of tactics, and this conversation, when I was speaking with Alma and Catherine, it occurred to me that, how might Latinx folks really sort of be in conversation with what I have often called cascading violence or recurring violence. And I'm a big believer in the work of Black-Brown solidarity and sort of building these networks of solidarity through diversity of tactics. And I think, the field of theology and ethics can be one of those tactics, and we often overlook it because of the ways in which people have experienced institutional harm because of religious trauma and so forth. But I believe in this vocation of theologian and ethicist. It's a prophetic moment right now for us who are in the field of theology and ethics. And so I'm sort of just going to offer some ideas that I have around imagining a shared future. And I hope that we have some time at the end to actually practice being in conversation with one another, because that's where the real work begins. As my people say, my roots go back to Oaxaca, Mexico. I'm second generation child of the U.S. and we sort of worked out our problems at the kitchen table. And so theology for me always happens in conversation, in relationship. And isn't that the beauty of imagining a shared future, if we can practice conversation in relationship? And so I really hope that we get to that place after I share my thoughts, and would welcome being in conversation with each of you. I've been spending a fair amount of time thinking, what might a shared future be, given that we actually live in a culture of recurring violence. We all witnessed the senseless violence perpetuated against our Asian communities in Atlanta last week. And so this question of what could a shared future be is actually really important for each of us, not least of which are those who are most impacted by systems of dominance that perpetuate recurring violence and create folds of cascading violence. I think the question of a shared future needs to be framed by hope and also take into account three things. One, our theological inheritance. Two, our theological imaginations, plural. And three, our theological futures, also plural. How do these three things inhibit, prohibit, or create conditions for a future framed by hope? These are sort of the things that live in my head all the time, that I'm sort of always wrestling with. My object of inquiry, if you will. When I talk about hope, I'm not just talking about being optimistic about change. When I talk about hope, I'm referring to living out our hope in ways that shape and shift our reality. The kind of hope I'm referencing demands a profound break with the dominant system, so that something like revolutionary love can emerge. The kind of hope I'm referencing points back to the resurrected life of Jesus, which was a profound break with the existing dominant system. How can we harness a moral imagination that frames our politics of hope around these terms? I want to start with a quote from a German thinker. Not all of Europe is lost. There are some good things there. I want to start with a quote by German thinker Ernst Bloch. He theorized about utopia. He said this, and he wrote a 3-volume sort of series on hope. And he said, we must believe in the principle of hope. A Marxist does not have the right to be a pessimist. Now, I know that there is a move around pessimism actually in the academy, Black pessimism. It's great discourse. It's important discourse. So it's like no shade to Black pessimism. I sort of recognize the move of pessimism in the academy and the movement. But what I want to focus on today is the principle of hope, but not just any principle of hope, the principle of defiant hope. So there is a bit of pessimism that I'm sort of, in my bricolage approach of doing scholarship, sort of looking at the generative aspects of pessimism framed through this word of defiant and bridging it with hope. So the principle of defiant hope. Another quote for you. Oscar Wilde once said, a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth glancing at. And I would concur. If our religious tradition does not steward the utopian desire for what can be, we should not even consider them. I'm calling these ideas hope as defiant because we are on the cusp of becoming better humans, because humanity is not yet there, is not yet here. We are still yearning for liberation, and we fight for the future to be human, some more than others. And being human with one another is part of creating conditions of a shared future. That's why our hope must be defiant. That's why the prophet must speak his and her and their wisdom, that hope must be defiant. That's why we must not stop at things like an eschatology of imperial optimism, but also lean into composting white body supremacy, which has guided our institutions and movements for a long time. We must not allow ourselves to be conscripted into assimilative politics, but work for a utopian vision that truly brings about the kind of world we long to inhabit and the kind of theological anthropology that creates conditions for the world we long for. We must steward revolutionary love as a matter of our politics of hope. This kind of moral imagination is a profound break with the dominant system that has preserved our theological inheritance in ways that have accelerated harm against the least of these. We must compost our theological inheritance so that we can imagine a theological future that lives the politics of the resurrection. Now, notice I'm using a term, compost. This is a really useful term from, ecology and botany. I'm not saying discard, dispose, throw away. Composting happens in the in-between spaces of the abyss of night and the dawning morning, where the chemicals break down the unnecessary things and generate the positive things. So composting actually could be really useful for our theology and ethics and our pedagogies and our church practices. And so I'm not saying we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as a lot of people say. I'm saying, what might composting enable us to do to actually create a shared future that creates networks of trust, that creates conditions for networks of solidarity, that then facilitates networks of belonging? And how might composting do the thing that helps us reimagine our theological anthropology? Because I can be really theoretical and lofty in my thinking, I actually prefer thinking from the shoulders up. I'm learning a different way these days. I thought tying these thoughts to scripture might actually help us think really tangibly about the politics of a defiant hope and how material consequences of our practices of defiant hope can be lived out. Now, I read the Bible as a theologian. I'm not a biblical scholar. But I turn to the Gospel of Matthew as one example of a utopia and a political hope that has material consequences. In the Gospel of Matthew, I think we see another fold of the prophetic future, the utopic horizon of what could be, of what is coming. Matthew chapter 10, verse 40 says, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me." Isn't that the kind of world we long to see? Isn't that what we are hoping for? We are not yet here, but this future is potential. That's why we hope in defiant ways. The gospel writer continues in verse 41, "Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous." And finally, in verse 42, "And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." Are we yet the kind of humanity we long to be? Are we yet beyond the cusp of becoming the particular humans we long to be? Our collective desire to be anti-racist, anti-oppression oriented isn't an ideal. It's a utopia. We can feel the warm illumination of this horizon, even in these moments, but we can't yet touch it. We can't yet embody it. It is just beyond our reach. Why is that? Our shared future depends on how we embody our politics and our practices. So much of the work of oppression is about policing the imagination, says Saidiya Hartman. What do we mean by hope as defiant? And what do we mean by being human in these moments? Let me start with the latter. When I think of being human, I immediately think of queerness, and essentially about the rejection of a here and now, rejecting the bullshit of assimilation and stable identities. It's an insistence on potentiality and concrete possibility for another world. Now, the Zapatistas years ago created another possible world when they rejected capitalism. And so these ideas that I'm sort of suggesting here precede, right? They've bubbled up in communities of color. They've already done this work. Hope as defiant is an ethical orientation toward utopia, toward the potential of utopia, toward a world that is not yet. It is an ethical practice of a normative horizon of justice. Now, some of you might be saying to yourselves that you've worked hard for a new vision for this world, especially after being cloistered perhaps all of last year, and that your hope for a new world has been disappointed by policies and procedures that actually work against an anti-racist, anti-oppression vision for this world. And to this disappointment, I say yes. Yes, we have to feel the disappointment in order to continue to pursue utopia. And let us not let Western metaphysics of what is true and false, because we know that the Western metaphysical binary is a problem, let us lean into something much more robust, like the feeling of potential. There's so much potential in our world right now. Do you feel it? It needs to be felt. And we need to have a felt sense of the cosmic potential so that we can harness our imagination for the utopia we long to embody. But you might be thinking, how is this in alignment with the pragmatic, well-intentioned, white dominant agenda? It is not. It is a call for not just for something new, but a call to be radical, a call for a deeper relationality and a futurity rooted in hope and the politics of the here and now, instead of keeping in step with the pragmatic, well-intentioned, white dominant agenda. Hope is defiant on these terms of futurity and relationality. Hope creates conditions for the not yet to be manifest in our midst. Hope tells of a future that is coming, a future that we can actually create, and a vision for potential that undergirds the politics of what is here and now. What is here and now is a fight for Black life, a fight for Black trans lives, a fight for immigrant and refugee lives, and for the soul of the country that has never appreciated the role of the Black person or any person of color more than what it can extract from us. As a trans queer Latinx, I long for a vision of humanity that acknowledges the politics of the here and now, the complexities of the work we must do, and a vision for a future that allows for the prophetic to actually take place. And when we lean into the prophetic, we are leaning into the potentiality of becoming human. And when that humanness is able to conscript us into her future, we truly become the vision we have been waiting for. So, will you join me in this defiant hope? Will you join me in imagining a utopia? Will you join me in the process of becoming human for the sake of the least of these who built this movement of justice for all of us? Will you join me in the process of becoming conscripted into the future of becoming human? Will you join me in the process of becoming conscripted into a shared future that lives the politics of the resurrected life? Now is the time to rethink the here and now and reject it because of its stale alignment with a white, well-intentioned, dominant agenda. Let us breathe life into the future of becoming human, and let that work start today. Let us breathe life into a shared future so that we can actually be the healing of the wounds. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Robyn. Okay, Catherine is here now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Robyn, for that. We are opening now the space for any questions or just responses that we are having to what Dr. Robyn just presented to us, whether that is emotions that are coming or thoughts, connections, anything like that you would like to share. We can begin a kind of communal conversation about what has been shared. So we invite you to spend some time thinking through it and sharing if you feel comfortable doing so.
Thank you. And yes, I see some of my colleagues from the Divinity School, and I like to do things in deep community, and I don't have the answers, but I can participate in responses. And I just want to invite my colleagues to join in the question and response, because collective wisdom is how we will build the shared future. And so I don't believe in cult-like figures anyway. So I just I look forward to a rich conversation with all of you. Thank you.
I'll risk saying words. Thank you so much, Dr. Robyn. It's good to meet you, even though we're on this incredibly awkward medium. Yeah. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful for this awkward medium, because otherwise we wouldn't see each other right now. So I was thinking as you were talking about composting. I love that, and I'm thinking about what it means to be conscripted. That was another word you used. I want to think through conscripted to the work of composting. So I'm going to be thinking about those, and I'll try to write you an email with more of my own thoughts on that. But thank you so much for those two images and thinking about them together. one of the things that I've found, because I'm old, one of the things that I've found as I've taught at the divinity school specifically, is that some of even the very young students, some of the ones who've come straight from college even, are already trying to figure out how not to offend anyone, how not to be defiant, how not to be perceived as defiant. And so something that a long time ago I started saying was, you're please be brave. And there are many different ways to be brave, because sometimes they'll end up hearing me saying there's only one way to be brave, and that's to find one cult-like figure who you can follow, because many of them have been brought up to, not all of them, but they're trying, sometimes they're, and our classrooms are set up in such a way that our large classrooms can kind of encourage that almost, hero worship of a particular figure and a particular accent and that sort of thing. So I want to say thank you, and I'm thinking alongside, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I if I can just respond to this, yes, this is an awkward first meeting. I know that we've shared some emails prior, and I've been a long follower of your work. I mean, 20 years ago when I was introduced to your work, actually through Steve Long, who was my seminary professor, and so it's just good to be in community with you, and to think alongside with you. I think often, and I know that we are all impacted by this, but we're all conscripted into this competitive relationality within academia because of capitalism and whiteness and all these different technologies. And so I have tried to take a different approach to pedagogy, and also just how do I be in relationship with people in non-competitive ways. Catherine Tanner, what introduced me to non-competitive relating 20 years ago, through her sort of depiction of the Trinity, and so that has been just with me for a long time. And to your thinking, being conscripted, we are all conscripted into modernity, and that and some of those things can be positive and negative, right? And what I find is that because of the machinations of our inherited theologies and inherited ideologies, actually acknowledge the conscription is a really important piece, because we can't get to the composting if we can't acknowledge, right, this conscription. And then just to your second point around composting, composting is a collective event. I mean, we may see one person go out and like put stuff in their compost bin, but it's a whole like ecology. And if we can actually like build these networks of trust and solidarity and belonging, like the future would be amazing. And we could restore the church to being the best thing we have on earth. But without that sort of collective orientation, it almost makes it impossible, right? And so I just feel really grateful to be in conversation with you and to be alongside you. It's a real gift for me.
Robyn, I love what you said about that we need to feel the potential in the world, because for me, sensing and feeling is very important. Feeling our environment, feeling and sensing each other is very important. But I wonder what does it mean to sense, to feel the potential in the US right now, for example? And especially, what does it mean for marginalized and oppressed community? to feel that potential.
Yeah, I mean, this is the work of all of us right now, whether we are in the academy or in the movement or in the church. And I just had a call with an Asian American woman, and we're thinking about this, like how actually do we respond to this moment? And I think part of feeling the potential is reading the moment. How do we read this particular moment? Because if we are unable to read this moment, then we are then also unable to feel the potential of this moment. So I think that the two are connected. That we must connect the dots intellectually, analytically, and we also must create capacity for an embodied awareness. Now, I know there's a whole lot of people who want to deny the body and like participate in Cartesian dualism. And let me just speak just from just a family history. My family have been practicing migration for generations from one country to another. There's a felt sense in my bones when I am in Oaxaca, Mexico. I can feel why my family left. And all of us, we need to get in touch with that felt sense. And then I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what is our vocation calling us to do when we connect with that felt sense? What does our advocacy look like? What does our sermons look like? What does our pastoral care look like? So I think there's sort of a trifold thing: the analytic, the intellectual piece, the sensing, the felt sense, and then the connecting with our vocation to live that out.
We have Nina who raised her hand.
Thank you. Hey, Robyn, it's wonderful to see you again and hear you and learn from you. Thank you so much. So I have a question. I'm not sure I can explain it well in English, but I'm going to try my best.
Sure.
What are your reflections in terms of the institutions, and in particular, institutional church? Let me explain a little bit what I mean by this. I do believe, as someone who studies from a social science perspective, that institutions play a very important role. And yet, because we are all constricted by this modernity and so immersed in white supremacy, especially here, but probably, I'm a Latin American and I've seen it all over Latin America too. Yeah. So it's not only here. So sometimes I feel I would rather get rid of institutions and start from scratch and just be in community like you have described, and keep that utopia and give my, turn my back to everything that has been created, because it's so, I don't want to, say a bad word about local churches, but still it's so present. Yeah. And not only in terms of race, I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say. On the other hand, what would we do without institutional church, right? I mean, we would be so lost without the minimum structures that allow us to come and form community. Anyways, I'm sorry for this very poor framing of my question, but I really look forward to hearing how you feel about these institutional dimensions of Christianity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's great to see you again. I don't think it's poorly framed. I think I understand it quite well. Let me say a couple things. I'm not anti-institutional because I don't know how to be, because I'm in all of the institutions, and So I'm not anti-institutional. I'm also not trying to preserve institutions. So I'm a complex person in that sense. And the institutional church in particular has accelerated so much harm against embodied difference. Women of color, LGBTQ persons, differently abled persons, etc. So I think because of this, I am much more for how do we imagine the local church that isn't an accelerator of harm. And I'm actually just about to be installed as the theologian in residence at Park Avenue Baptist Church in Atlanta, and I'm sort of helping them with this, right? Like, how does this historic Baptist church live into its identity as a local church that reduces harm against the least of these? And I think what I find is that a lot of times the local church is not invested in theological reflection or ethical reflection. Now, there are probably lots of pastors on this call, and I think we need to be real with one another. Like, how do we actually live out our theologies and ethics in community instead of reifying institutions that are accelerators of harm? So this means, I think, that ordained persons need to wrestle with what does it mean for them to be clergy in a system that is accelerating harm against people? What do we do with that? How do we act? I mean, I come from a Baptist tradition where the sort of centrality of the liturgy of the service is the sermon, whereas in other traditions it's communion or the Eucharist, And so how do we actually do our liturgies in a way that don't accelerate harm? How do our clergy people and our laity work together to do harm reduction? I think it's like the institution is the shell, but institutions are made up of people. This is like when I do talks for corporate institutions, they all want to like be diverse and equitable and inclusive and whatnot. And I'm like, but you just because you hire a person of color doesn't mean that you're now diverse. It means that you've tokenized this embodied difference, and the policies that you have in place are actually harming them. And so we have to be able to think both at the hyper local and at the macro, and negotiate those two things to decelerate harm and actually live a political hope, right? Live this utopia. And I think without doing that intellectual and emotional labor of the hyper local and the macro, I think we just end up sort of perpetuating institutional harms, in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't know if that gets to the core of your question, but those are sort of my thoughts off the top of my head.
Yes, thank you so much. And I look forward to more opportunities to
Gracias.
talking about this. Gracias.
So we have a question in the chat by Leah Smith, who's asking, what piece of advice would you give to young people, especially theologians of color, who have trouble explaining the impacts of white supremacy and white institutions to young people that are not people of color?
Well, I think this is why I often help people think about our theological inheritance. You know, there's a lot of people who want to refer to people like Augustine and Anselm, but how do those thoughts and theologies get operationalized in community? And how then do those create norms and then maybe accelerate harm? And so I'm sort of a weird maybe person, because I want to look to the tradition and to the present moment and figure out how to be in relationship with it all instead of just bypassing it, because I think that's also where a lot of harm gets done. And so I want to encourage young theologians of color, and also younger theologians who are white, to actually do the discernment work. And we are of this microwave generation, McDonaldization, where we want to bypass the work of discernment. And actually, discernment is really important as we sort of try to steward the politics of Jesus. And it, I guess the advice I would give to younger theologians is, are you able to sit with the complexity of the tradition? And can you ask, why were certain people written out of the tradition? Like I'm always really curious why we don't refer more to medieval female mystics whose theology was deeply embodied, rich and robust, and yet we don't really hear much, right? And so this seems like an important strand to support female voices in the tradition and female thinkers in the tradition. But because that gets eclipsed and doesn't get picked up in the local church, we then don't offer classes in this area, right? It's all connected. And so it's inviting younger people to look for what's missing and learn how to ask questions. And then, younger theologians who are white, I think, bear a responsibility to do the same. It shouldn't just be up to people of color to ask these questions. We should all be asking these questions. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Robyn, for that. We'll give just a few more minutes to see if there's any other questions feelings steering that we would want to share.
Is it okay if I say one other thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
In classes, I've found that sometimes white students will turn to students of color and ask for an explanation, ask for help thinking through things. And I've in the past suggested that, I assign a lot of movies, I assign a lot of film in my classes, in part because people can go and watch and think and be confused on their own without having other people have to explain things to them.
Right.
Anyway, that was if it's okay for me to say, I think it's okay for students of color, for people of color to say, you know what, go watch these 3 documentaries and this film and this, and then think about them all, and then let's talk. Right. But not until you've done all of that work and been really confused, and then don't expect me to put everything together for you. I think that's a faithful response to somebody's help me understand.
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit earlier. we don't have any networks of trust to actually have these conversations, and if we can rehabilitate trust within our communities, we can maybe lean into some of these conversations. But you're absolutely right. We all need to be sending white folks to like learn the histories. I mean, this country has no historical memory, right? Like, it's not even 50 years ago or so that we call them internment camps, but we put Japanese people, we incarcerated them unjustly, illegally, right? We have no historical memory. And so, white folk, I mean, we all need to do our own sort of history about our people and the world that we live in. But you're absolutely right that we need to invite folks to be laboring for themselves so that we can have these conversations. Thank you.
I have another comment. I mean, I love what you were saying about, but not love that fact, but I think you are on point with that church are accelerators of harm. And so I was wondering, we work in an institution that provides theological and ministerial training to future pastors. And the reality is that sadly, many of the pastors who lead this kind of churches that accelerate harm had been trained in institutions like ours. And so what do we do? How can we form or be part of the formation of pastors who will not create that kind of environment, that will not be accelerators of harm?
Well, I mean, I think it is in part being able to expose people to a diversity of knowledge production and being able to have classroom space to help pastors connect the dots. And I mean, I think that it's one thing just to train pastors in sort of a curriculum that teaches them theology, but that theology gets operationalized in institutions. And I think we have to do our due diligence as educators to actually explain, like, this is how this theology gets weaponized against people. These are how ethical norms get weaponized against people. I mean, I just think about, just this as an example, how female-bodied persons, how things like the pro-life, pro-choice arguments get weaponized against women. And how do we actually practice a generous, orthodoxy, a generous humanity with one another, when, so many of us are suffering from accelerated harm? So I think it's deeper relationality and theological reflection and a lot of hope.
We have a question by Johan Alvarez, who asks, what is the importance of social or collective dialogue when we talk about building this shared future?
Well, I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. And I think that social and collective dialogue is vital. I think that so often so often we expect one person to have all the answers, when that is actually not how society works. Society is a collective. Society is an ecosystem. It's the possibility of shared relationship. How do we lean into that possibility in these practices? I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote Activist Theology and then launched the Activist Theology Project is I wanted to imagine, how actually do we be human with one another? Because I don't know that the church is doing it. I don't know that the academy is doing it. And so how do I bring together people who can like model the kind of democracy and relationality that we need to see, and then like work with other people to do that? And so it takes a diversity of tactics. And if we think that one author or one voice or one way is the answer, it's a lie. And that's the devil's work. And I mean, I get asked all the time, why do I spend time with white women and white men? And I'm like, well, we all need liberation. Like, it's not just black and brown people who need to be free. And so, you know, like I know that there's a lot of people who may not like, Paul, but like Paul was in relationship with a lot of different people. So how can we sort of practice that kind of multiplicity in a generous way? So I think social and collective dialogue is the way we need to be doing this work. I think it's ground zero for the work of liberation. I mean, we see that in the tradition of Latin America, in liberation theology. It's communally focused, right? In the base communities, right? It's all community. But then we get here to the United States, and it's neoliberal subjectivity, it's hyper individualism, it's we depend on one person to give us the truth. And I call bullshit on that. Pardon my language, but like we have to invest in community. And this society here doesn't know how to do that. And so we end up operationalizing harm that is completely avoidable.
Do we have any other questions? Again, I just want to give a little bit of space if there's any questions or comments left. Yeah, so I think, we've been here an hour, so I think, Alma, would you like to send us off?
Yeah, I would love to continue with that conversation. I was just enjoying so much this time, but I know that people, we all have other commitments. But thank you so much for all of you, and thank you for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Henderson Espinoza. And for those of you who don't know, and I know there are some incoming students here, so maybe you want to tell us what kind of what classes you teach at Duke, and if you are teaching a class in the fall, I think that would be helpful for the new students who are here to know that.
So I teach every spring in the sort of field of queer theory and theology, and it sounds like I might be teaching a liberation theology class in the fall. Is that right?
Yes.
So I'm trained as a liberationist, and read in the area of liberation philosophy and liberation theology, and just trying to create a better world through teaching and relationships and following the ways of Jesus.
Well, thank you, and nice to see you all. And for those students who are planning to come to Duke, welcome. And blessings to you all. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Bye, everybody.